I didn't think they liked me. You know, that you always think there's some people in the audience and who hate you. So you get nervous, you know.
Paul McCartney. The world knows him as the nice Beatle, the melodic genius, the smiling diplomat, the one who held the Beatles together when everything else was falling apart. But here's the truth. Paul wasn't always so nice. Behind the charm and the sing-along classics, McCartney carried grudges, fought rivalries, and clashed with some of the biggest names in music history, from bitter studio battles to public betrayals, to friendships turned into feuds. These are the 5 musicians Paul McCartney disliked the most. Yoko Ono. When John Lennon brought Yoko into the studio in the late 1960s, the entire atmosphere of the Beatles' recording sessions shifted. The Beatles had always functioned as a tight-knit unit, with wives and girlfriends kept away from the inner circle of creation. But Yoko Ono changed all that. She sat by John's side during recording, sometimes even offering input on arrangements. 4. Paul, a man obsessed with precision and studio discipline, this was intolerable. He once said, "It was weird. It was like having a partner sitting on your artist's shoulder." McCartney believed Yoko disrupted the fragile balance that kept the band together. Tensions escalated during the Let It Be sessions. While McCartney tried to steer the ship musically, Yoko's presence emboldened John to resist Paul's leadership. What had once been playful rivalry between John and Paul now turned into open hostility, with Yoko acting as a symbolic wedge. Though Paul softened in later years, even performing with Yoko at events honoring Lennon, the scars of those late Beatles years never fully healed. Yoko wasn't just John's partner. To Paul, she was the living embodiment of the band. Next on our list is legendary producer Phil Spector, the man behind the famous Wall of Sound, and, according to Paul McCartney, the man who ruined one of his greatest songs. After the chaotic Get Back sessions, John Lennon and George Harrison brought in Spector to salvage what became the Let It Be album. But Paul was left out of the decision-making. The breaking point came when Spector took Paul's delicate ballad, The Long and Winding Road, and smothered it with strings, choirs, and harps. Paul was furious. He believed the song had been stripped of its simplicity. In a letter to Apple Records, McCartney demanded the orchestral layers be removed. His request was ignored. To Paul, this wasn't just bad production, it was an insult to his artistic integrity. The resentment ran so deep that it played into Paul's decision to sue the other Beatles in 1970, legally dissolving the band so he could regain control of his music. Years later, Paul released his own version of the song on Let It Be, naked, stripping away Spector's work entirely. To McCartney, Phil Spector represented everything he despised about losing control of the Beatles. D's collapse. Our third entry is perhaps the most surprising. Paul McCartney's friendship-turned rivalry with the king of pop himself, Michael Jackson. In the early 1980s, Paul and Michael collaborated on several hit songs, including The Girl Is Mine and Say, Say, Say. Their friendship seemed genuine. Paul even gave Michael advice about the music business, suggesting he invest in music publishing as a way to secure long-term wealth. But that advice came back to haunt him. In 1985, Michael Jackson outbid McCartney to purchase ATV Music Publishing, a catalog that included hundreds of Beatles songs. Overnight, McCartney's most treasured compositions, from Yesterday to Hey Jude, were under the ownership of his former friend. Paul was devastated. He later admitted he felt betrayed, saying, "I think it's dodgy to do something like that, to be a mate and then buy the rug you're standing on." Though Jackson insisted the deal was just business, Paul never forgave him. For years, McCartney lobbied to regain control of the catalog. Only decades later, after Jackson's passing and multiple business sales, did Paul finally begin to win back ownership. This wasn't just a business dispute. To McCartney, it was a personal betrayal, a reminder that even friends could turn. into rivals when money and legacy were at stake. Perhaps the most complex entry on our list is Paul's relationship with his closest creative partner, John Lennon. Together, Lennon and McCartney wrote some of the greatest songs in history. But behind the harmony lay fierce competition. Paul was the perfectionist, the arranger, the taskmaster. John was the raw genius, impulsive and rebellious. By the late 1960s, their differences had turned into open warfare. Paul wanted the band to remain disciplined. John wanted freedom, both artistically and personally, especially with Yoko at his side. Their arguments spilled into the studio, sometimes bringing sessions to a halt. After the Beatles' breakup, the feud grew even uglier. Lennon mocked McCartney in interviews, calling his solo work "muzak" and taking shots in songs like "How Do You Sleep?" Meanwhile, Paul fired back with barbed lyrics in "Too Many People." And yet beneath the bitterness, there was love. The two men reconciled in the late 70s, spending time together in New York before John's tragic death in 1980. McCartney has often spoken of missing his old friend, proof that even in rivalry the bond between Lennon and McCartney ran deeper than dislike. Still, for much of their careers, Paul's greatest source of both inspiration and frustration was John Lennon. Finally, we come to the longest-running rivalry of them all, the Beatles versus the Rolling Stones. In the early 1960s, the two bands were friends. Lennon and McCartney even gifted the Stones their early hit "I Wanna Be Your Man." But soon the media began framing them as rivals. The Beatles were the clean-cut pop geniuses, while the Stones were the dangerous rebels. Paul often downplayed the rivalry, but subtle digs continued over the years. Most recently, McCartney made headlines when he called the Stones a blues cover band compared to the Beatles' broader musical palette. Mick Jagger fired back on stage, joking that Paul was welcome to join the Stones at any time, though, mostly playful, the rivalry reflects McCartney's competitive streak. He wanted the Beatles remembered as the greatest band, and wasn't above dismissing the Stones to make the point.